Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have on Galem Girmay. Galem is one of Salesforce.com's top 16 sales professionals for 2021. She runs the What Is Your Legacy podcast and is the co-founder of Rev Genius, an online Slack community with over 12,000 members. Today, Galem and I dig into how she chose her podcasting path, the impact it's had on her personal and professional relationships, the value of community, and plenty more. I hope you enjoy the episode. So recently I talked to Chris Lochhead, and if you know anything about Chris, it's that he's not shy about the language that he uses. Some of his favorite reviews that have been done of him are, I'm using finger quotes, off-putting to some, and that he uses profanity needlessly. But I had him on this show actually, and one of the things that he talked to me about was what he called hustle porn. And basically that's making rah-rah podcasts all about the grind and getting after it. And I actually love that point because I think theme is a major issue in podcasts. In my opinion, a podcast shouldn't just be a conversation, but it should have a theme or a way that it breaks through the noise and either helps or gives a perspective. And that's why I love your podcast. It's different, it's your own, and I want to talk to you about that. And that's where I want to start today, is how you came up with the idea for What Is Your Legacy?
Yeah. So this idea is something I've thought about for years. Not the particular idea, but I had the desire of having a podcast of some sort. I just didn't know what it was going to be about, so I didn't start it yet. So I waited for the opportunity to come to me and the spirit in a way, or the challenge of coming to me. And so what happened was I lost my foster mom about 6 years ago now. And I was left with, the usual feelings of grief, sadness, and all of that. And also a lot of questions like, what kind of life did she truly want to live? How did she want people to remember her? And we didn't have those type of conversations. So it created this deep level of curiosity for me to better understand the people around me and my network, and to truly hear from them directly, like what type of life do you want to live? What do you want to leave behind? And what's happening right now? And what are you doing to truly live that mission and that purpose? So that's essentially, to make this story a little bit shorter and to summarize, that's where it started. And now it's kind of evolving into a lot of different things. But that was the inspiration for my podcast, What Is Your Legacy?
And I love that because it's no secret that salespeople, as a stereotype, like to talk. And so a salesperson starting a podcast, you see it all the time. I mean, it's the same in marketing or really any walk of life at this point.
Yeah.
But I do love the fact that you waited until you had a real theme that you wanted to tackle. If you go through, and I look through some of the guests on your podcast, some are names that I know and see kind of on the podcast circuit, and others I haven't. But the one thing that is prevalent in all of your episodes is that you're talking to people about something that they're not as comfortable talking about, that they're not able to just do rise and grind and get after it, but actually talk to them about something that maybe they haven't considered before. For you, was it a chicken or the egg kind of situation? Did you have the idea first and the theme first, or did you know you wanted to start a podcast first?
I knew I wanted to start some type of podcast for probably, I want to say, between 3 to 5 years before I actually started it. So it was something that I had thought about. I would love to have my own podcast because I have so many thoughts with me. But to your earlier point, I didn't want to just start a podcast for the, state of starting a podcast. I didn't see a purpose with that, to just be talking about nothing. Like, this isn't going to be another like Seinfeld like podcast series like about nothing. As much as I love Seinfeld, it was just not what I was going to do for a podcast that I'm representing. So it took that life moment for me, and accumulative like moments for me. That was just one out of two that happened in my life, of losing my foster mom many years ago when I was really young. I lost my dad as well. So it was just this like buildup of so many different experiences and stories, and just the curiosity around other people's thoughts around this topic of life and legacy, and deeper things like death and the meaning of their lives and what they want to leave behind. And I just love having those type of conversations. So it started with the desire to have a podcast, and then I waited for the moment to have the purpose of my particular podcast.
And it's great because if people listen to your podcast and they see people whose names they recognize, and then they get a chance to hear different answers than they're used to getting. And I think that's one of my favorite things about your podcast is I listened to this morning, I listened to the Andy Paul episode, and your first question to him, he's like, okay, we're doing this. I actually need to take a second to think about my answer. And you're talking not always to salespeople, but I think that's a lot of your network are salespeople. So these are people who love to talk by nature. And then for the first question to really kind of not stump somebody, but, realizing that they have to have maybe a little bit deeper thought. What's that like on your side to be able to hear those answers?
It's the best experience. This is why I love doing it. Like, I look forward to each conversation, because each one of my guests that I get to have these deep conversations with, they have unique stories to share and unique perspectives. And that's what I love the most about it. And to your point too, like, I absolutely love when people have to take a pause and be like, hold on, I need a moment to think. And some have been like, oh, you can edit this out. And I'm like, absolutely not. We need the silence to fill the room, because it brings just a different level to the conversation when you get people to truly think and feel about their answer. And here's the thing too, I think the topic of legacy, it's such a heavy topic to talk with someone about. And I think some people might feel like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to say the right thing, answering certain questions. And what I always tell everyone who feels that way is that there is no right or wrong answer to this. And you are allowed to change your way of thinking about it. As you progress, as you change in life, that's like the beautiful thing about growth, is that you are able to change your perspective along the way, because you're going to have so many different experiences in this life. So just because you have one answer to one particular question today doesn't mean that in 5 or 10 years or even 6 months, you're going to think about that same question in the same way, because your perspective might have changed. Your circumstances might have changed. So yeah, I love these type of conversations, because I learned so much about the other person, and I've been able to really get closer bonds with people and truly hear things about them that a lot of people in their own circles don't even know yet.
And they may not even know that was something that they wanted to ever say or realize that they thought about their legacy. I mean, when I remember talking to you when you were going to get your podcast first started, and I hadn't really ever thought about my legacy. And I remember it like made me feel weird. I don't know exactly what the term is for it, but like, I'm talking to you about your podcast and you want to get it started. And I'm like, man, like, I do a podcast. I guess that is going to kind of be some of my legacy. And, these are things that are just going on in my head, right? Like, I'm like, one day when I have like 4 generations beyond me, they probably won't ever listen to my podcast, but at least like it's digital and it exists, versus like our great grandparents. I mean, maybe you have some photo somewhere, but I was like, it is kind of cool that, we're recording our lives more than any other generation in the history of mankind.
Yeah. And there's so many different ways to do that too. And I think for those out there who don't have a podcast yet, or they're thinking about getting one, the thing isn't that you have to have something just because the people around you have it, or define your life around the ways other people are continuing their lives. Obviously, Justin, like, you have a love for podcasting and helping people kick off their podcast and having conversations, and you've helped me a lot around thinking about the specific things around developing your podcast, and you've given me so much of your time to do that, and so have other people around me when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to many other different topics. And the thing about how I think about legacy is that, yes, you can do something big like that, like a podcast, or you can create content, or you can write a book. And there are many things you can do to physically leave behind or digitally leave behind for someone. But you can also touch people's lives, because that's what this is about. You're going to touch people's lives in one way or another. And if you can do that through communication, if you can do that, maybe just if you listen to someone's podcast and you hear an episode and it impacted you so much that you shared it with the next person in your life, and that person was impacted by it, maybe in a similar way or a very different way, and they shared it with the next person, that in itself is to carry on a perspective, a thought, a mind shift to somebody else to help them in their lives. And you're creating a legacy if you're able to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just, and it's the reason that I put out this podcast is, the intent is to help people. And for me, it is, B2B tech companies with small marketing teams who are thinking about podcasting. And, the reason I wanted to bring you on is just to talk to you, about a variety of things, but I think even though companies are very quickly moving towards making podcasts, I still think that whether you're a network security podcast that's looking to demonstrate thought leadership, I still think that it's so important to have an angle to what it is that you're doing. You knew for years you wanted to start a podcast, but you refused to do it until you actually had something to say. And I think that's so important from everyone, from the people who want to do the rah-rah podcast and talk to their buddies to, companies that are making a very serious podcast, that finding really where the space that you play is just so important to really, actually be able to have people want to come back to listen again.
Yeah, it really is. It's about having a clear mission and a clear purpose and reason for doing something. And if you yourself can be clear on that to begin with, it doesn't have to be perfect. You can start, like when I started my podcast, it definitely wasn't perfect. It's not where it's at today. And I'm nowhere close to perfect. Nowhere close to done with this. It's just, it keeps expanding into different spaces because circumstances are changing. Like I wasn't even on, maybe I was actually, now that I think about it, maybe I was on Clubhouse, but not so active on Clubhouse when I kicked off my podcast. Right. And then a couple of weeks or months into doing it, the podcast, I started to get really involved on Clubhouse. And now it's like the next thing. And then who knows where it's going to be a year from now, or 2 years or 5 years. But that doesn't really matter yet. I'm just focusing on the present. And I think that's what I'm learning. I'm learning so much from my podcast by talking with other people. It reminds me that I need to live in the moment. Like what is happening right now is important, and that's what's going to help create the future that I desire for myself and for the people around me. So yes, you do need to have a reason for starting something, unless you're like this huge celebrity who people just like to hear talking about nothing. Then sure, go ahead, just sit and talk with people about nothing in particular, and people will tune into that. But unless you're that individual, you got to come with some substance to the table, to the virtual table, or in real life table, whatever it is. You got to come with something that's going to make people either think, or it's going to help them further along with whatever they're doing in that particular theme or niche that you're dealing with.
And I talk about that all the time. You can have a podcast with Jason Bateman and Will Arnett interviewing Adam Sandler, and they can talk about, golf and Adam Sandler sneakers or whatever it is that they want to talk about. And people will listen because they care about them because they're celebrities. The problem is the vast majority of people who are starting podcasts are not household names. And so you need to go the other way, which is lead with value and content, which, I think that you're doing a great job of with your show. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the evolution of your show. And, when we had our conversation before this, I think either I or you or a combination of us, use the term one woman band, and how you're putting this thing together and how you're doing it. And I don't know if you are just like you doing it yourself or you're leveraging, other folks. So I am curious because as anyone who starts a podcast will realize, especially when they kind of bootstrap it on their own, is that there are a lot of moving parts. It can be as simple as recording audio, but if you are, and what I'm guessing, maybe you're not a perfectionist, Galem, but someone who does care about what she puts out, as you talk about legacy and all these things, you probably care about what the production quality is and that it sounds professional and things like that. So how are you going about putting together your show?
Excellent question, Justin. Yes, I am somewhat of a perfectionist, but I have learned in many different areas of my life that I cannot be that person if I want to achieve bigger things in life. That doesn't mean I don't pay attention to details. I absolutely do, as much as I possibly can, but I don't let the idea of doing something perfectly to stop me from doing anything at all. I think that's important to understand, is if you are that person who's like, yes, I'm a type A person, I like to be in control, I'm a perfectionist. If those are like the labels that you're putting on yourself, I think you need to reevaluate why you're putting those labels on yourself and what you can do to change that, to go in the direction that you want to go with in whatever part of your life. So podcasting has definitely taken up a lot of time. I am what I refer to as a one-woman band. I'm doing this solo right now. And part of it is because this is my creation. Like, I have, up until recently, in the past few years, I never considered myself being a creative person, because my association with a creative person was somebody who's doing music or somebody who's an artist or doing something, creating something like that. And I wasn't that person. I tried to be that person. I never had the desire or passion for it. Then when I got into, business, sales, and now podcasting, it's something I consider being a creative part of the process. So I don't necessarily love all aspects of podcasting. I think that's where you have to think about what are your strengths and weaknesses, and what are the at least minimum that you can deal with. So like what I can do until I have all the resources in place of having a team to help me, because you need to have some money for that consistently. And I have particular goals in my life right now to save money for certain things that I choose to. It's an active decision, an active choice, not because I couldn't do it. It's not because I couldn't outsource this to somebody else. That definitely would take a lot of time away from me, which would be great. But I have certain goals. So I have to align myself with those goals, align myself with those values that I consider being important to me in life. And so it takes so much time doing a podcast on your own. So you have to be prepared for that. I always like talking with people about the good and also bring up the not so good side. I don't want to call it bad, but the not so good side, because it's going to take you a lot of time. It's going to take you a lot of mental energy. You have to have certain equipment if you want some level of quality. Um, and you just need to be very strict with yourself. Like, I know that every Saturday I need to edit the following week's podcast. I need to do the audio file, I need to do the promotional video. I need to prepare in advance so that when it releases early on Tuesday morning, it's all done. I don't need to start my week thinking about my podcast, because it's all done on Saturday. And so I've set up certain things that I now expect myself to do on a weekly basis. So that's one way to do it. The other way is obviously, like, you can batch your work. I have tons of, not tons, but 5 to 6 episodes that I've already recorded with guests. So I know what's going to come ahead, so I can plan out uh, the cadence of releasing my episodes, and also I know ahead who the next guest is, so I can always create the storyline within my podcast. So like Justin, you've listened to my podcast obviously, so you probably know this is too, is that I always end each episode introducing the following week's guest, because I already know who the following week's guest is. It's not a surprise to me, and I don't need it to be a surprise to the audience either. I actually would like the audience to look forward to next week's release, and that's just how I keep it going. So
Yeah, and I think that the good and the bad of podcasting has been what has led to both my passion for this space, as well as to realizing that there was some room to play.
yeah.
You are defying the odds of how long a podcast lasts, which is about 5 to 10 episodes
Yep.
before someone decides, I don't want to do this anymore because it's too much work. And we saw that ourselves firsthand. We, like pretty much any podcast agency, doesn't come from a podcasting background because it just didn't exist years ago. So as a media creation company, we started our podcast, and the first thing we realized was this is hard to do. It takes a lot of effort.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's very rewarding
Yeah.
as the person creating it. And that there's a business model there where if we can provide those services to people and they don't have to do the hard part of it, and they get to have the really nice piece of it, which is having these amazing conversations and creating content. And Galem, I'm similar to how you are. I never viewed myself as much of a creative person. I mean, you've seen some of the assets that we provide, but I'll put a lot of that on Tristan and a lot of our design team and what have you. I'm not sitting there creating cover art.
Right.
But at the same time, this show is like my creative outlet for someone who is drawing stick figures at best. But I feel like I get to be creative and I get to ask questions that I want to know answers to, or I get to have these engaging conversations that aren't just, us having like a happy hour, but diving into subject matter that maybe we're not diving into with other people. I mean, maybe people ask you often what you're doing to put together your show, but I love digging in with podcasters and finding out what, the people in our space are doing and where it's evolving and what have you. And it's just a medium that's fun to put out that kind of content for your audience. And I feel a lot of those things that you're saying. You are also putting together some assets as well, which I've seen. Talk to me about, because, when it comes to being able to promote your show, you need to do more than just put it onto Apple Podcasts and Spotify and say, this thing's going to dance for me. I mean, it won't. You need a way for people to see you, because again, we're not Adam Sandler or something like that, where people are going to find you. And so you're doing a great job still as kind of a one woman band of putting out assets. What are you doing for repurposed content for yourself?
Yeah, in all honesty, like would love to do more of it, but I don't have the time for it. But what I do is I put together the promo video, which is 1 to 2 minutes for each of the episodes. I sometimes do those like short clips, just audio clips, and that's pretty much it, And then I put the content out on social, like LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter. But again, like there's so much more that I will be doing and that I want to be doing. It's just a matter of figuring out, like when you are one person on a team alone, there's only so much you can do. And like I have a full-time job during the day. I have the podcast that I do with the conversation itself, takes an hour. Then I have a clubhouse room every Tuesday for 45 minutes. And then I have the editing piece of the podcast, the audio, the video. I mean, it's a lot of time spent creating something, you know?
You give yourself not nearly enough credit. I see so many podcasts just put out there a link to maybe where it lives, either, on a website or a landing page, or to Apple Podcasts or Spotify itself. I mean, the fact that you're doing promo videos in addition to the editing, in addition to, oh, by the way, running a 12,000 person community while also working a day job, again, defying a lot of odds. And, I don't want anyone to take away from the fact, if you're creating any assets with your episodes, especially as a solo creator, it's just going to be huge to be able to get your show on the map. And I want to talk about some of the other things that you're doing in addition to your podcast. I know you're going to be launching on YouTube soon. You're doing some interesting stuff on Clubhouse. I think that's where I want to start. Clubhouse is this app that you can use to basically talk to people about anything. And my understanding of the way that you're using it is, you have these conversations with individuals on your show, and then you're able to go and actually interact with your audience. You basically, if you've ever listened to a podcast, which anyone who's listening here has, you craft questions in your head that maybe you have of what you're hearing. And then you give people the opportunity to actually come and talk to you. Talk to me about how did the Clubhouse idea come to be, and how are you using it as part of your show?
Yeah, it's a part of my strategy, which I want to go back a couple of steps in this conversation, is that you have an idea about a podcast, you have an intention, you have the desire to take action on it, and then you need to have a strategy in place of how is this going to happen so I can go past the average numbers of episodes that somebody would release, which you said was between 7 to 10, somewhere along those lines. And I've heard that number before, so I think it makes sense, 7 to 10 episodes, and then kind of most podcasts would just crash and you would never hear from them again, and it's super disappointing. I'm sidetracking now, but I'll get back to the point. I have found certain podcasts out there. I'm like, oh, this is an interesting topic. Or I was looking for a particular person, found out they were on this random person's podcast. I go check it out, and there are like 5 episodes. Yep. And immediately I get disappointed. It's kind of like having a website with contact information and then never updating it ever. It's like, why do you even have a website to begin with and put your information out there if you're never going to care about updating that and make it accurate?
I don't know if you ever watched or read Game of Thrones, but George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, is like the quintessential pod fade. I mean, the guy wrote 3 of his whatever it was supposed to be, or 4 of his 7 books, and hey, he's just never gotten back to it because it's hard, and his books are 500 plus pages, and they took him 5 years or whatever it was to write each one, and he suffers from it just as much as any of us do, even though he's got an HBO series that made him millions.
Yeah. Again, priorities. But going back to, strategy, was the point I wanted to make, was that you go into this world of creating a podcast and you have a strategy. And part of my strategy with Clubhouse was, it was this beautiful moment of being a part of the community on Clubhouse and just listening into different conversations. And then I saw a few people recording their podcast on Clubhouse, because that's a different audience from any of the other social platforms. And so I thought, well, what if I just had a room? This was before I created my own club on Clubhouse. So I just had weekly rooms every Tuesday. I kept it consistent now for a couple of months since I started. I think I missed one Tuesday, and I had a few people being like, what's happening? Why aren't you here? Like, what's going on?
Is everything okay?
Yeah, is everything okay? I'm like, it's all good. I just needed a day. But I should have communicated that. So learning as I go. But anyway, it just came to me. It was this, moment of opportunity, is that when you see a space and you're like, okay, what's happening here with the conversations are some really deep, beautiful moments, because that's what happened in a lot of the rooms I get to be part of. And then I thought, well, my podcast is all about connection. It's all about conversations. It's all about stories, being able to be authentic, go really deep on stuff. And I thought, wouldn't it be so amazing if my guests, some of them, could just come on Clubhouse and connect with the audience. And I was thinking about it from the perspective of, I would love this experience. If I
Mm-hmm.
heard somebody's podcast and I'm like, I like this, I am subscribing to this, I would absolutely love to have some of those guests to have a direct conversation with and interact with if I don't already know them. So I put those things together, and then that became part of my strategy was that, okay, I'm going to every Tuesday I drop a new episode, and also every Tuesday I'm going to have a Clubhouse room and invite some of the guests in and just have a conversation with the audience. And so I've been doing that. And then now my strategy is kind of shifting a little bit. So instead of inviting guests, like they still have the option, but now I give my guests like, you have a choice, I'm giving you a choice of, you can either join me and the audience on Clubhouse and we can do it just audio there because you might be just comfortable with that. Or strategy number two that I'm kicking off very soon is my YouTube channel, where you can come to YouTube and we can have a conversation there live with people. So it's at the core of both of those options and strategies, it's just the idea of connecting with the audience, because I listen to a lot of podcasts and I would love to be able to directly connect with either the host or the guest of that podcast. I think that's like an experience that I wanted to create with my podcast, so people know like, okay, I tuned in, people are investing 45 minutes of their day at minimum listening to my podcast. So that means a lot to me. So I'm like, how can I in some ways give back to my audience who's investing time into something I've created? I think that's one way to do it, is to do that.
Yeah, so selfishly, I just bring my favorite podcasters onto my show, and then I get to just spend all the time with them myself.
I mean,
But
that's another strategy though, Justin. Like that is another strategy. And you are sharing it with the audience.
yeah, of course. And as we talk about audience and community, I do want to talk to you a little bit about the community that you've built. I don't know that everybody knows, although at this point it feels that way for me if you live kind of on the LinkedIn, Twitter sphere. But just, do you mind telling me a little bit about what is Rev Genius and how did you land on starting a community?
Yeah. Rev Genius is a community for revenue generating professionals. So anyone out there who's into sales, marketing, rev ops, leadership, and that's pretty much what the community is made up of. And it's become a global community. So we have people from all around the world. I think we're sitting at like 12,000 members right now, community members, and it's just a place of bunch of resources from, how do I do my job? Maybe you're an SDR, BDR, AE, maybe you're a sales leader having specific questions and want to network with other leaders in your space. Or maybe you are somebody who just looking for a job or other types of resources that could help you in your life. Or maybe just somebody who likes to network and connect and be part of roundtables or mentoring, or there's a lot of different options that the community can do and serve and help with. So that's what the community is about. It started, I want to say officially, I think we got the Slack channel in like June of 2020 is when it kind of kicked
Crazy.
off. Yeah. But before that, this is the fun part, is actually how it started. It started with a very small group of people on a LinkedIn group chat. That's initially how it started, like 15, 30 people, somewhere along those lines. And then that kind of got really overwhelming really quickly because the app started to crash, because when you have 15, 30 people just chatting back and forth, multiple time zones all the time, uh, things tend to crash. So we were then asked, Jared and I were asked to go ahead and like find another space for this. And the suggestion was Slack. So we're like, okay, let's go to Slack. And then from there, it just grew and grew and grew. And this is where we're at right now.
And I know you mentioned that, I mentioned that you're one of the co-founders of Rev Genius, but you mentioned to me that you're also involved in a variety of other communities as well, online communities and others. How is being part of like-minded online communities helped you with your podcast?
Mm. That is not something I really thought about other than the obvious, where it's like, maybe it's not that obvious. I don't know. You tell me. But uh, the relationship building, that's number one reason why I'm a part of communities, why I wanted to start something with Jared for community building, was the relationship aspect of this. And so when I'm a part of different communities, it's for the purpose of building relationships and connections with people. I'm not there to sell any one of my solutions. That is not the purpose. That is not the mission to why I'm there. I'm looking for a place where I feel welcomed. I'm looking for a place where I feel appreciated. And I'm looking for a place where I feel loved, and I feel like I belong here, right? I have a place here. That's why I go to communities. That's why I go to certain groups of people, and they need to very much, this is another really important aspect for me, is that the people I'm surrounded with, they need to be sharing some or all of the values that I share in my life and that I find important. So that's the other aspect that I consider being important for me when I think about building community or being part of as a member of a community. So the obvious answer to this is that when you start building relationships and connections with people, then obviously you start to create a bond with those individuals. And then you get more curious to be like, okay, I wonder what this person thinks about their life, their legacy. And that makes me go, hey, do you want to come on my podcast and have this conversation? So that's kind of the thoughts I have about how can a community help you with your podcast. Is it's the relationship building aspect, but it needs to be in a very genuine way. It can't be like, oh, I know this person is a part of this community and I have a desire to have this particular individual on my podcast because maybe they're popular, maybe they're famous or whatever. That can't be the reason, because that's not going to work and people are going to see through that all day long.
Yeah, for sure. And, I heard recently Chris Walker on Nick Bennett's podcast. And if we just talk about community here, Nick, who I met through Rev Genius, who you also know, I mean, it's like, you can start doing your spider web, but he says, stuff that may be obvious to you isn't obvious to everyone. And sometimes it's just giving that content away and the amount of people that'll say thank you. I think just because of the nature of who you are as this community builder in this space, it seems so obvious to, you join communities and you establish these great relationships. But, someone like me, when I first started, Rev Genius was the first one that was recommended for me to join. I didn't know the power of community, that I really would build lifelong friendships, and interactions with people who I talk to now every day that I don't work with. That I check in on and ask questions to, and you just, going into the pandemic and before it, I didn't really even know that was a thing. I mean, it was to an extent, and it just changed my life and the way that I view online communities and the ability to relationship build. And I don't know the exact number, but I'd say somewhere around like a third or half of the people, who I engage with on a weekly basis, I'm involved in some sort of community with them. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a very powerful tool that can certainly be used, sure, when finding podcast guests, but I think it just goes to that bigger theme of relationship building.
Yeah. At the end of the day, for me, it's all about being able to build meaningful, impactful relationships. And then it's also turning some of those, if you have the opportunity, not everyone does that in a safe way, to turn the online relationships that you have with people into an in-person relationship, because those are different. Like, think about ways in the times in your life when you started a relationship with someone, a friendship with someone in person, versus when you started a friendship with someone online and then turn that into in person. It's really not the same, for me, at least in my experience.
And I think that was my view. I think I had spent so much time in my career. I started my career in sales, and I spent time going to conferences and whatever, just like everybody else, and going out for drinks or whatever it may be. And I don't know that I believe that you could really start friendships on Twitter, start friendships on Slack channel that you joined. And then, eventually having those people on my podcast, creating content together, launching podcasts for friends of mine. I mean, it's remarkable what online communities were able to do for people during the pandemic, for me especially.
Yeah, agree.
And the last piece that I wanted to talk to you about here, as we talk about relationship building and community building, is what you're doing for helping women in sales. Talk to me a little bit about that as well.
Yes. So women in sales, they just have this special place in my heart because obviously I'm a woman and I work in sales. So I can relate to that. But not really, like, it's I have an interest and desire to help anyone who's in sales, whichever gender you're part of, whoever you identify with. But specifically right now, I'm focusing on helping women in sales. So I've had women reaching out to me on LinkedIn and asking me specific questions. And a lot of times it tends to be somewhat of similar themes going on, right? Like, how did you do this? Like, I've had companies and individuals coming to me, how did you kick off your podcast? Where did you start? Like, it feels overwhelming. And then I would talk to them about that. Or somebody would come and say, like, I notice you do a lot of videos, and I have this like video diary that I'm doing now every single day. And so people start asking me questions about that. And then most recent thing is women coming to me asking me about sales, and they're asking me specific questions around prospecting. Also, recently, it's been a lot about building a personal brand. How did you start building your personal brand? Because I'm the person who just popped up one day on LinkedIn, and all of a sudden I never left. And people were like, who is this woman? Like, who are you? What do you do? Where did you come from? Like, it's so random for people, but I that's just, it was random for people, but it was intentional for me. I knew what I was doing. I knew why I wanted to focus on building a personal brand versus building on a corporate brand. Two very different things to me. And so, yeah, I've had women now recently coming to me asking me, like, how did you start it? Where do you begin? Like, I have a desire to do this too, but I just feel really overwhelmed. So what I ended up doing was I said, all right, I'm having 5, 6 different women here from all around the world. Half of them are in the US, the other half are here in Europe. And I said, let's just get together. Let's just do this. I'm not charging anyone anything. I'm just saying, let's join this crowd. Let's all come together and let me give you my experience. It's not me telling people what to do or how to do it. It's more me spending time listening to understanding, one, why do you want to build a personal brand? Because as great as it can be, and as fun as it can be, there's also a lot of challenges with that. There's also a lot of, again, going back to podcasting, time invested. There's some good stuff, and then there are not so good stuff about building a podcast, building a personal brand, doing anything in life. There's always going to be two sides to that coin. So I encourage people to think about that. So I have conversations with these women of understanding, why do you truly want to build a brand? Because you don't want to be just noise out there. You want to have something meaningful or impactful or purposeful to show up with, and truly be who you are at the end of the day. And so that's what's happening right now. So I'm putting together a group of 6 women to help them develop and work on building their own personal brand. And I'm super excited about it. So that's like part 1 to helping women in sales. Part 2 is going to be more tactical sales advice and things that I've helped women, like, that I mentor on the weekends, to really dig deep into, stuff around their day to day. Like, what are the metrics they should be looking at? How do you set the expectations with yourself and the people around you? How do you, things I would consider like, oh, this is simple, I know how to do this. How do you build a report in Salesforce to help keep up with your metrics? Things like that, that somehow some sales managers or sales leaders are not teaching their sales reps. And I find it so crucial and critical to be able to hold yourself accountable, to reach a higher standard. You need to know certain basic stuff. So I'm trying to help as many women as possible to do that.
Well, we'll have to have a recap episode in like 6 months to see how these 6 women have progressed. It sounds like an interesting reality show that we could follow them along the entire way. But here I go thinking about different ways to create content. I do not know where you find the hours in the day. I know I put out a lot of content, but I have an entire company behind me supporting me. The amount of stuff that you put out and you have your hands in is just remarkable. We're coming up on our time here. If there are other women in sales, men in sales, anybody in revenue, what have you, what are the best ways to find you, Galem, to listen to your show, to join Rev Genius? What are the best ways to get in touch with you?
Okay, so I would start with LinkedIn. All of my contact details are on LinkedIn, from 3 of my emails to my cell phone number, to my Clubhouse name, how to start getting involved in Rev Genius. Everything's there on my LinkedIn. So just go to Galem Girmay on LinkedIn and find the contact details there. I think that's the most centralized place right now for people to go to.
Awesome. Well, Galem, thanks again. I really appreciate you joining me today. It was
Yeah,
great
thank
having you
you.
on Recorded Content.
Yes, it's been awesome. Thank you.